Welcome to the Radhakamal Mukherjee Memorial Lecture. Professor Radhakamal Mukherjee was a leading thinker and social scientist of modern India, playing a vital role in championing the Indian independence movement. He served as a professor of economics and sociology and vice chancellor of the University of Lucknow. He was the recipient of the Padma Bhushan, the third highest Indian civilian honor. Together with Professor D.P. Mukherjee and Professor G.S. Ghurye, Radhakamal Mukherjee pioneered the study of sociology in India. He played a vital role in transforming Lucknow University into a major center of sociology and social anthropology. Under the scholarship of the triumvirate, Radhakamal Mukherjee, D.P. Mukherjee, and D.N. Majumdar, Lucknow soon emerged as a leading center for social science studies, and it remained so until the mid-1960s. He's among those scholars who is responsible for nurturing and strengthening the Indian Society of Labor Economics in its formative years. The Society every year pays tribute to him by organizing this lecture in his memory. This year, the Radhakamal Memorial Lecture is being delivered by Professor K.P. Kannan. He's Honorary Fellow, Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum. I request Professor Kannan to please grace the dais. The lecture has been chaired by Professor Indira Hirway. She is Director and Professor of Economics, Center for Development Alternatives, Ahmedabad. Ma'am, kindly grace the dais. Professor Indira Hirway is Director and Professor of Economics at the Center for Development Alternatives, Ahmedabad. I now request ma'am to please conduct the session and also introduce Professor Kannan.
I think there is no need to introduce Professor K.P. Kannan to this audience. He is right now, as mentioned by Priyanka, chairman of the, she didn't mention that, of course, I'm mentioning, that chairman of the Laurie Baker Center for Habitat Studies. He's also chairman of the Academic Council of the same organization. He's honorary fellow at Center for Development Studies, as well as honorary visiting professor at Institute for Human Development. He was expert member at ILO in the technical secretariat, and he was also member of the very well-known National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector. He is widely published in India and outside. We are really very happy to have him here. And he's speaking on a very important and interesting subject, that is India's elusive quest for inclusive development and employment perspective. I now request Professor Kannan to deliver the lecture.
Thank you, Professor Indira Hirway, for your kind introduction, and also Priyanka for anchoring and introducing not just me, but the entire gamut of guests who have come here to participate in the 62nd annual conference of the ISLA. Without much ado, I'll go straight into the subject. India's elusive quest for inclusive development and employment perspective. I would like, if those of you who would like to consult some of the tables, please keep the printed copy in hand so that I will refer to it, not frequently, but once or twice. I feel honored to have been invited by the President of the 62nd Conference of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, Professor Alak Narayan Sharma, to deliver this prestigious lecture in memory of one of the tallest social scientists India has ever produced. Radhakamal Mukherjee was a polymath of prodigious productivity. That's how Ashwini Seth described him when he delivered this memorial lecture in 2015. T.S. Papola, someone with a very long association with ISLE, including as its president, dealt with Radhakamal Mukherjee's life and work and the significance of his inter- and transdisciplinary contributions. Radhakamal Mukherjee wrote only 53 books. When he delivered the Radhakamal Mukherjee Memorial Lecture in 2014, it was a much needed exercise since studying social science has become, in my view, so segmented across and within its constituent subjects of economics, sociology, politics, and so on. Radhakamal Mukherjee is said to have loved the large picture that allowed him to move easily between subjects and disciplines in his long journey to understand Indian society and its economy. Drawing from this spirit of looking at events on a broad canvas, I intend to focus on the relationship between economic growth and employment in India since independence in general and the period since the introduction of neoliberal economic reforms in particular. It is the result of this inquiry that prompted me to characterize the Indian experience as an elusive quest for India's growth story, especially since neoliberal economic reforms, has indeed been an impressive one. It's also part of a larger story of resurgent Asia, as Deepak Nayar has brought out in the path-breaking work on the rise of Asia in the world economic stage. He noted that India's growth performance during 1991 to 2016 was the second highest after China among the Asian 14 that Professor Nayar selected as leading this resurgence. At the same time, India's rise is quite below potential, and the lead in Asian resurgence is mainly due to China, preceded by other East Asian countries. However, when one goes into the details of India's rising economic power, there are disturbing trends and new challenges. The glaring one is the persistence of absolute poverty and deprivation, and the other is the glaring deficiency in the quantity and quality of employment. Of course, these two are closely interlinked problems, reflecting two sides of the same coin. From a growth point of view, India's aggregate growth performance at an annual rate of 7% for 3 decades, from 1991 to 2021, is outranked by 1.8 times, 180%, the growth rate at 3.9% during the earlier 4 decades, from 1951 to 1991. However, as we shall see in detail, the employment situation has given enough reasons to be worried. The adverse impacts of instantaneous policy reforms, as well as exogenous shocks such as the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, were all felt first in the employment situation of mostly informally employed workers and their families. The demonetization of currency in 2016, followed by the hasty implementation of a GST system in 2017, disequilibrated the fragile but extensive informal economy, leading to loss of jobs and thus livelihoods of large numbers of people. This was followed by the global COVID-19 induced pandemic in early 2020 that witnessed a massive exodus of informal workers from urban centers back to their villages in search of safety. Most of these shocks were ultimately absorbed by the rural economy, resulting in a widening of the rural-urban gap. Policy attention continues to be disproportionately directed at the urban economy. Employment is more than an economic variable, and it is critical to ensure a decent standard of life. It also imparts a measure of dignity and self-worth that could lead to social and cultural well-being. I have therefore taken this occasion to ask myself a series of questions as per the following. 1. What was the initial condition at the time of independence in terms of the relationship between population growth and workforce growth, that is, the demographic dimension? 2. How does India perform when we connect growth with employment in comparison to global trends as well as its Asian comparators? 3. Is there an exclusion from the labor market? And in the context of the debate on missing women in the labor force, what are its gender dimensions? 4. Does inclusion in workforce ensure an escape from poverty? If not, what are its dimensions and who are the working poor? 5. How serious is the problem of quality of employment? And lastly, 6. How do geographical, social, educational and gender differentiations influence inequalities in employment-related outcomes. Following Radhakamal Mukherjee's preference, my attempt here is to look at this large picture over a long period of time and then focus on in some detail over the last 4 decades that covers the entire period of neoliberal economic reforms. In particular, I intend to highlight the various dualisms that characterize the economy, posing several old and new challenges. Question 1, the demographic burden. When viewed from a global perspective, there is no doubt that India has gone through a relatively more burdensome demographic process. From the beginning of the 20th century to the present, 120 years, a long duration view shows that the world population grew at an annual rate of 1.3%. In contrast, India experienced an annual rate of 1.47%. Even during the half century, 1901 to 51, before the country's independence, the growth rate was 0.9% per annum compared to the world average of 0.83%. Higher population growth in independent India could be viewed as a developmental irony because the increase in population results from a decline in mortality that was made possible by the modest economic growth and equally modest state intervention in health and other welfare measures. Indeed, the process of demographic transition is on its way, although much slower than, say, in China, its legitimate comparator in economic performance. In fact, there seems to be a regional pattern in Asia in which East Asia has attained relatively early demographic transition, followed by Southeast Asia, and then by South Asia at the bottom. This is evident from the annual growth rate in the working age population for the last 3 decades, ending with 2020, which I give in table A2 in the appendix table. This demographic experience is a primary determinant of the size of the labor force. However, there are other powerful factors, including social norms and practices, governing labor force participation, as we all know, of women. A larger scenario comparing the country's experience with that of the global and the regional, including 2 countries with large populations, shows that the difference is more pronounced for women in India than men. That constitutes, in my view, a social challenge for India and other countries in South Asia, not in Southeast or East Asia, to attain the levels reached in other parts of Asia. A comparison of population growth and the growth in the number of workers throws up the difficult period that India has gone through before independence. Available data for 1911 to 1951 tell us that while the population grew by 52% during these 40 years, the workforce growth was only 16%, 1/6. Given the large-scale dependence on primary production and the labor-intensive character of non-agricultural activities, one can then imagine the state of affairs from an employment point of view. Based on census figures, Radhakamal Mukherjee pointed out that the share of industrial workers to total workers was a mere 11% in 1901, which fell to 10% by 1931. Alice Thorner's estimate of the workforce in agriculture and related activities at 75% in 1901 and 76% in 1951 also suggests the generalized nature of economic stagnation from an employment point of view. For the next 40 years, beginning with independence, 1951 to 91, the gap reduced to 134% and 125% for population growth and workforce growth, respectively. Yet, the gap was not fully closed. Interestingly, the next 30 years, that is 1991 to 2021, the growth in workforce by 67% marginally exceeded that of the population that registered an increase of 65%. But because of the past demographic thrust, we already have a much huge base than before. Demographic transition has undoubtedly set in from a broad employment perspective, though much later than its comparators. Question 2, connecting growth with employment. Such a broad comparison with crude measures of workforce is only one side of the story. From the point of the challenge of inclusive growth, let alone development, an employment perspective would suggest that we connect workforce growth with overall economic growth. And that is done by measuring employment elasticity with reference to growth. Historical data are hard to come by for a comparative exercise, and therefore, I have taken the readily available and comparable data for 30 years, beginning with 1991, which coincides with the beginning of neoliberal economic reforms. The emerging global picture is one of declining employment elasticity, which I gave it in page 10, table 1, suggesting the intensification of capital globally in every unit of output produced. But given the trend in new technological changes, one should include in the intensification of capital the investment in human capital that drives technological changes based on computers and information and communication technology. Barring China, India has the lowest employment elasticity for 1991 to 2020 and each decade. By this calculation, the last decade was one characterized by job loss growth, given the negative sign of the elasticity. That certainly should be a worry in a country with a declining work participation rate compared to the growth in the working age population in both South and Southeast Asia and the world. This declining ability of economic growth to create employment in India calls for much deeper investigation and reflection beyond, I suppose, economic theories and categories such as social segmentation and exclusion that a Radhakamal Mukherjee method would certainly approve of. A word about China is colorful. China's employment elasticity is so puzzling, to say the least, despite controlling the population growth rate drastically, resulting in a working age population growth rate that's only half of India's. The employment absorption is considerably lower than India's. What it suggests is the highly capital intensive and technologically driven nature of China's growth, disregarding the important human dimension of employment. I'm not going to elaborate on this because that will take me away from the subject. This declining employment elasticity in the Indian context needs to be looked into in some more detail. In our comparative exercise, both globally and other parts of Asia, I took the ILO data, which is standardized for the working age population and workers between 15 and 64, and the national income data is a standardized one in PPP dollars given in the World Development Data. By taking a longer period and an expanded classification of workers in this table that I'm exhibiting, 15 years and above, I'm capturing all the workers irrespective of age, all adult workers, the declining nature of elasticity of employment is quite evident. Are there exclusions from the labor market? Now, we come to here I will summarize, it's somewhat a longer story, but I will summarize in two parts. One is we talk about the people whom Professor Basole and others refer to as not in employment, education, and training needs. But for me, it's not that classification characterization. I call it labor underutilization. And for me, I have the ILO support for that. There was a World Employment Report which emphasized on measurement of labor underutilization. That means out of the working age population, those who are out of work and out of education. So all those are characterized as labor underutilization. Now, we normally say that whoever is out of labor force, not just work, and out of education or voluntarily unemployed because they can't come social reproduction and various other responsibility. I will show you in a very quick, simple calculation that doesn't stand to test. Now, these exclusions are two in nature. One, we measure the labor underutilization. And what's interesting about this underutilization is that what's coming here? Is it okay? Thank you, Priyanka. There's something coming. if you split the working age population into educated and less educated, and I take secondary level as the threshold. So secondary pass and above as the educated, below secondary, then you find the proportion of labor underutilization in India for the last 35 years, 1983 to 1819, which is the normal year. 1920, I'm showing, which is the first year of COVID. So there is some going back to work out of pressure for women. So you can just see both the years. And we find for the educated category, there is no increase in the proportion of labor underutilization. 56% in 1983, in fact, 55 in 1819, 55, 56, same, and 53.8 in 1920. The moment you come down to education less than secondary, in 1983, there were 49.5%, half of the adult women were, their labor was not utilized, gainful purposes. That jumped to 66% after 35 years. And there's a small reduction because of the COVID in 1920. So that's one measure. So the entire burden of labor underutilization category has fallen on the less educated and not on the educated, despite higher rate of unemployment. Now, the second one on this is the debate on missing women. When we talk about missing women, then we don't talk about out of work and out of education, out of labor force and out of education, because those who are seeking work are counted as looking around in the labor market. Their presence in the labor market is recognized, and you all know that very well. Here again, when I put this threshold of education, there are no missing women, hardly. Compared to 1983, today there are not hardly any missing women, because you will find the change 50.9% in 1983, 52, in fact, that has increased a little bit, 1.3% change, but 1920 again back to 50. So the incremental missing women is only 2 million in 1819 for the normal year. But what has happened is, because the demographic population growth that gets reflected in the working age population, the total numbers have increased. So if you had a stock of 6.31 million women in the missing category in 1983, it increased to 80.6 million. 80. So this is the demographic burden showing up. Although percentage-wise, it remains the same. So you have the same problem looking at in different terms. So the absolute magnitudes are often or sometimes more important than the shares that we look at. But if you look at the below secondary, the missing women category, as in the case of the labor underutilization, that's where most of them are. From 49.2, it increased to 65.8%. 65.8, so about 16.6 percentage point increase in 30 years. So, and with the result that you have an incremental number of 45.5 million and a stock of 180 million as against 86 million before, 152 if you take the COVID year. So that's the orders of magnitude of this problem of labor underutilization and, yes, missing women. Question number 4, the class of working poor as a manifestation of inadequate inclusion. I'm sure we'll all agree that the bottom line on linking growth with employment in a poor but growing economy is the need to reduce and then eliminate poverty. India's ability to absorb the growing labor force as workforce may seem to be high, as in other developing countries. However, this is because poorer segments of the population have no alternative but to engage in some kind of work as a matter of survival. However, detailed empirical work were carried out earlier by Sundaram and Tendulkar in 2002 that show a consistent decline in the incidence of poverty measured by the national poverty line, which at that time was somewhat less than 1.9 PPP dollars that we talk about today. Today it is around that or little more than that. Between 1983 and 2000, and they focus more on 93 and 2000. Decomposed by household types such as self-employed and wage labor in both rural and urban areas. And that's the interesting part of that work. So you decompose the working poor into their characteristic of the household, whether they are labor households or self-employed households. This decline, and there was a decline in the incidence, and they said this decline has been attributed to the economic reforms and consequent acceleration in aggregate growth, followed by a shift of labor from agriculture to non-agriculture. That's what they attributed it to. It works through an increase in real wages, both in rural and urban areas, as well as an increase in the average years of education. The authors view the apparent decline in WPRs as a matter of labor market tightening. However, the bottom group is that of the casual labor, which they emphasize. Casual labor households in both rural and urban areas, given their poor asset base, some water please, unsteady employment, and often the lowest wage rate. There is no doubt that there has been a decline. Thank you. There is no doubt that there has been a decline in the incidence of poverty in India, including for the most vulnerable group of agricultural laborers and their households. But the decline is with reference to a national poverty line below that of the international extreme poverty line until recently. Poverty and its determination have been a subject of much debate and controversy, although it seems to have receded in recent times since there is no official poverty line now. One should add that the direct subsidy of the state in India towards poverty alleviation has also increased, although its contribution in reducing poverty is not much explored. I have therefore made a fresh attempt to measure the decline in the working poor based on household labor status. Because in the NSS questionnaire, you can identify the households based on their majority income, either as in rural areas, agricultural labor households, self-employed in agriculture, self-employed in non-agriculture, or other labor. In the urban areas, either you are self-employed household or casual labor household or regular wage labor household. Since the national poverty line has undergone changes in weights of its components as well as the use of price indices leading to controversies, I have taken the two international poverty lines, one of purchasing power parity dollar per capita per day for extreme poverty, that is $1 for 1993-94 and 1.9 because dollar inflation adjusted for the 2018-19 measurement. And the poverty standard PPP $2 for 93-94 and 3.2 for 2018-19. And I have taken the equivalent in rupees and looked at the consumption expenditure. So let me summarize that. First and foremost is the overall decline in the incidence of poverty in terms of international norms of both extreme poverty and poverty. That is PPP dollars 1.9 and 3.2. For all the households, extreme poverty declined from 35 to 29%. But 93 to 2018, that's 25 years. So a quarter century, took a quarter century for a decline from 35 to 29. During the 25-year period that we have taken here, against the higher threshold of poverty, the decline was from 82 to 67% for all India. Secondly, this overall incidence camouflages the crucial difference in place of residence. It matters whether you are rural household or urban household. For various reasons, urban residence results in a significant lower incidence of both extreme poverty and poverty. It is also evident that the rural-urban gap has also increased. In 1993-94, the incidence of rural extreme poverty was 2.7 times higher than the incidence of urban poverty, whereas in 2018-19, the gap increased to 3.3 times, 330%. For the higher threshold of poverty, that is 3.2 PPP dollars, rural poverty incidence was 1.4 times and 1.9 times higher than urban in 93 and 2018 respectively. Whether the economic reforms and its consequence of higher economic growth has contributed to a reduction in both threshold of poverty, and if so, to what extent, are issues that we will examine a little later. Perhaps at this stage, it is safe for me to conclude that urban India experienced a much faster decline in poverty than rural India. Third, from a labor status point of view, casual wage labor households have the highest incidence in rural agricultural laborers plus other laborers and urban areas. Therefore, the employment route to poverty reduction for this class of working poor, that is casual labor, poses a greater challenge than other classes of labor households. Last, but certainly not the least, is the educational factor. Here again, I divide the households into educated households and less educated. Educated households are those where at least one member is above secondary or above. Less educated are those households where there is no member with a secondary or above. And that's the difference. All categories of labor households with a threshold level of education of secondary level and above demonstrates a greater propensity to reduce the incidence of poverty. In the urban areas, except a minuscule share of households, 3 to 5%, all of them have crossed the extreme poverty line. For the higher threshold of poverty, only a quarter of the households with education are poor in 2018-19, while for the less educated, it's a little more than half. For rural areas, households in the educated category also show a much lower incidence than those in the less educated category. But the gap seems to have narrowed down, except for the urban areas, for the higher threshold of poverty. And you will find these more detailed calculations in these tables. While this empirical profile gives us an idea of the unequal distribution of the working poor, the picture would get much more nuanced when a more crucial factor, or so I find, introduced. That is the social group identity of the households. We shall come back to this more in a more elaborate fashion in terms of structural cum institutional profiling of the working poor in the country a little later while talking about the challenge of inequality. At this stage, it's enough to note the difference between the bottom group of SC/ST and others for a quick comparison between 93 and 94. So if you take the extreme poverty figures for SC/ST in 1993-94, for those who are less educated was 56% the incidence of poverty, while others it was 38. For urban areas, it was just the half, 27 and 17. That makes a big difference. And the same gap remains in 2018-19 also. What is striking is the low incidence among educated households in urban areas, suggesting even for SC/ST households, if you are located in urban, suggesting the high level of average education beyond a mere secondary level. However, an increase in the incidence of extreme poverty among educated households between 93 and 2018 raises some fresh issues. There's an increase in that need further investigation. One plausible reason could be the effect of poorer households moving to the educated category with at least one member, but they remain poor without a perceptible improvement in living standards. Question 4, growth effect on poverty reduction. One way to determine the extent to which economic growth in the neoliberal era is responsible for reducing poverty is by estimating the elasticity of poverty reduction with reference to growth. Our exercise shows that for every percentage growth in output, the percentage reduction in extreme poverty by this PPP measure is a mere 0.11% and 0.12% for the higher threshold of poverty. But the striking aspect of this reduction is in the differential impact as between rural and urban. For extreme poverty, the elasticity of poverty reduction for urban areas is 3 times that of the rural. For poverty, it is little more than 4 times, both the thresholds. Data limitations prevent us from a comparison of all social groups here, but we'll come back to it a little later. Question 5, the challenge of quality of employment. Much can be said about the quality of employment in India. Despite the acceleration in aggregate growth, it continues to be an underdeveloped economy with some notable improvements in human development indicators and a structural change towards non-agricultural economy. One of the major challenges in the quality of employment is the labor market structure that continues to account for half of non-wage labor, that is self-employment. So I will not repeat all that. But the unsteady nature of employment for casual workers is one of the main underlying reasons for their higher incidence or vulnerability to poverty. Detailed inquiries and studies are now available on the conditions of work and various vulnerabilities of informal workers. What has emerged from the work of the erstwhile National Commission for the Unorganized Sector, which Professor Kamala Shankran referred, is the increasing share of informal workers in the formal sector. Of course, the employment dualism is rooted in the structural characteristic of the Indian economy into formal or organized and informal or unorganized sectors characterized by low capital labor ratio as well as by employment size. However, the employment dualism is more than the structural dualism, wherein we now find a majority of workers in the formal sector of the economy are employed informally. The sum and substance of the core characteristic of employment in the Indian economy is the insecure character of a whopping 92% of the workforce that seems to have remained steady since independence. Similarly, the share of employment in the informal or unorganized sector has also remained steady around 78 to 80%. In Radhakamal Mukherjee's seminal work, The Indian Working Class, published in 1945, this kind of categorization of the workforce was not in vogue, but he was conscious of this dualism. He spoke about the workforce in agriculture, including the landless and distressed migration to the cities, as well as export of labor through labor sourcing by British overseas capital to other countries, and the conditions of work and life of those who migrated to the cities for employment. While much of the book is devoted to the industrial working class, their problems and remedial solutions, he prefaced this by a broader survey of the economy from the point of employment. He championed the country's planned industrialization and envisioned a transfer of poor laborers from the low productivity economic activities to high productivity economic activities, early 1940s. In that sense, he was foreseeing a Lewisian transfer of surplus labor much before its theoretical formulation by Arthur Lewis. To quote, planned industrialization in India will, in the first place, integrate the small cottage and decentralized industries with the bigger factories and workshops, bringing craftsmanship up to mass production standards and rehabilitating the former in both the urban and rural economy of the land. This would make transition to full industrialization easier and at the same time combat the social dangers that are associated with large-scale industrial production concentrated in a few great industrial cities and towns. Secondly, it will bring about a close connection between agriculture and industry through the processing of agricultural products and raw materials. When he concluded his first chapter, Radhakamal Mukherjee spoke, or so I think, as more of a visionary than as an economist. He wrote, with new orientation and coordination between the city and the village in the future, we shall find that the science and technique of the city will utilize the resources and raw materials and replenish the wealth of the village more than it will exhaust, and its life will stimulate the minds and enlarge the vision of a far greater number of people than it will wrap or repress. Unquote. In this book, he dealt with the question of minimum wages and he worked hard on it. He was also a member of the Committee on Minimum Wages for Industrial Workers at length. He and his students conducted many studies, including his collaboration with the King George Medical College in Lucknow, to determine the calorie intake required under Indian conditions. The sum and substance of that, what he recommended in terms of calorie requirements at 3,000 calories was far above that was later considered by successive Indian governments and even in the latest Committee on Minimum Wages. Radhakamal Mukherjee recommended a national minimum wage but excluded agriculture and what he called agricultural industries, as he called it. The saga of getting a statutory sanction for a national minimum wage is a long and continuing one in India, reflecting a certain stubborn political economy whereby the lives of the laboring poor receive the least priority in the political agenda. In 2018, the Government of India appointed a minimum wage committee, the Satpati Committee, to which ILO provided technical and also even personnel to work out the elaborate details of what could be a minimum basket of consumption, that recommended a national minimum wage of rupees 375 per day, 2017-18. But the Government of India rejected the report quickly, its own committee's report, and fixed the minimum wage, a recommended minimum wage, non-statutory minimum wage, at rupees 178 per day, just half of what was recommended. A majority of countries has accepted the concept of minimum wage, but the challenge is in implementation. From the point of inclusive development, it acts as a floor level wage to prevent the incidence of the working poor. I will skip the rest of it because that's not very important, except to say that if one applies the latest Satpati, I find it very interesting, this 375, because it's scientifically calculated on every component of a minimum basket that they have recommended. If one applies this committee's rupees 75 in 2017-18, the proportion of workers getting a wage below this level works out to 58%, or 205 million workers for men, and 54%, that is 56 million workers for women. If I adjust this to 2018 and 19 prices, then the percentages increase to 62 and 75. That is 225 million and 85 million respectively. As a country, successive regimes in India consistently fail to ensure a minimum wage recommended by its own various committees and commissions. The last question, the challenge of inequality. Here I will not go into the details of the text that is there before you, except to show you two kinds of inequality issues, because we are talking about a reduction of poverty from 35% to 29%, 1.9 PPP dollars. How does it work out in actual field? So I take the different characteristics of these households in terms of rural, urban, educated, less educated, and social groups, 5 social groups, ST, SC, OBC, Muslim, and others. And I get around 64 segments for rural areas and around 24 for urban areas. And then you decompose this. This is, of course, our youngsters can do much more econometric analysis. That doesn't satisfy me because I can't see which segment has exactly more than the other. I can't do a comparative analysis. So I do this one, and you can see this ladder of poverty, working poor in terms of households. The bottom is above 50%, above 50%, 50 to 59% incidence of poverty in the bottom group, and that consists, except one, all of them are SC, ST, and all of them are rural, and all of them are less educated. And the clustering of these barriers become a stubborn thing. At the top, less than 10%, except for one small segment of SCs with higher education, and in urban areas, all are highly educated, urban residents, and mostly belonging to the socially advantaged group. So that is the spectrum. Less than, it's actually 2%, to 59%. So this is one aspect of the inequality that comes out of the growth in terms of the basic satisfaction of going out of poverty. Then I look at the what I call when I look at the wages, because that's an important component of the growth process, and that is how the trickle down happens. And there I take 160 groups, because I differentiate the education not just below secondary and secondary and above, but in 4 classes: primary, middle, secondary, below graduate, and graduate and above. And similarly, rural, urban, and various other categories you will find. And it is also there in my paper chapter on the long tail of wage inequality in the India Social Development Report produced, edited by D.N. Reddy and T. Huck, who passed away recently, and produced by the Council for Social Development. And this is the long tail of wage inequality. The interesting part is long tail, that is, this vertical line shows this is where the 375 rupees stops. So you can see the segment of people who are getting below this 375 rupees per day. And at the bottom 25%, all of them are women, rural, less educated, belonging to SC, ST, or slightly still disadvantaged, but less than the SC, ST class. So there is a clustering of social, educational, locational, and gender characteristics. So you can imagine your fight is not just the gender fight. You have to fight in 4 fronts at the least. And that's how it is. So I will conclude. Can I take 5 more minutes, ma'am? 5 more minutes? Just the conclusions, and then, yeah. Yes. Okay. From an employment perspective, the challenge of inclusive development clearly brings out the challenge of creating both the required quantity and quality of employment. The particular challenge in the former is the low and declining opportunities for women to participate in gainful employment activities. The problem of quality is perhaps much graver than the quantity. And that's where you get the working poor. You work to remain poor. Given the low, if not declining, opportunities for regular work with reasonable earnings to ensure a standard of living above subsistence. Even this notion of subsistence is satisfied for this category of workers only when we consider the internationally determined level of extreme poverty, not the higher threshold. If it is raised to the higher threshold, the challenge for India seems to be quite daunting, with 2/3 of its households living below 3.2 PPP dollars. Or a monthly consumption expenditure in rupee terms of 8,200 to 8,500 per household in 2018-19. Such an outcome during heightened economic growth, a trend rate of growth of 7% for more than 30 years, is manifested in increasing inequality that has been highlighted, but hardly noticed as a policy variable by successive regimes. The need for the development of underdeveloped sectors such as agriculture and allied activities, along with the sprawling small-scale industrial and service sector activities, is quite evident. All these boil down to a great degree to the need for a sustained rural development process. But neoliberal economic policies work through a process of betting on the strong. And that happens to be through the urban-centered private corporate entities on the one hand, and an urban-oriented, educationally advancing and asset-holding population, a disproportionate share of which come from the socially advantaged groups. Such an outcome has exacerbated economic and social inequalities and strengthened the dualisms between formal and informal employment on the one hand, and urban and rural areas on the other. Instead of a course correction, political regimes after regimes have only sharpened and strengthened neoliberal economic policies, unmindful of its distributional consequences. Much of the initial and evolving gaps in social and economic and educational inequalities have a rural setting. And I talk about the coming fourth industrial revolution and how that is going to really affect employment creation, because we still don't know. It's a Schumpeterian process of both destruction and creation of employment, and we still don't have even credible estimates even for advanced countries. Then I say that if political will can be summoned along with an overall rethinking of our priorities, I think there are reasons for hope. The first is the rising educational attainments among the youth, since it is crucial in seizing new opportunities for gainful employment. And that's what in the presidential address also that came out, the role of education. For example, while only 14% of the adults in the Indian working age population, 20 to 39, had educational attainment of secondary and above in 1983. After 30 years, it reached 48%. So nearly half of the youth have at least a secondary level of education. Secondly, there are several environmental challenges exacerbated by climate change. In the Indian context, as with most other developing countries, this has assumed many dimensions and levels from the local, regional, and national. The concept of environmental sustainability provides a much needed new framework for economic planning and policy. The search for a greener economy is grounded in this framework. The ILO's 2018 World Employment and Social Outlook, titled Greening with Jobs, estimates that there will be a job loss of 6 million in the energy sector, but a job gain of 24 million globally, and thus getting a net job gain of 18 million. I think an environmentally sustainable framework could give much needed developmental push to the rural economies subject to political. For India, this could reduce the currently increasing gap between rural and urban economies. This calls for considerable research on the employment potential of moving towards a green economy, given the regional and agroecological variations in this vast country. I conclude that although dictated by their individual national contexts and challenges, the world seems to be preparing for a relook at the neoliberal strategies. But in India, politics seems to have successfully separated itself from economics, and consequently, the challenge of inclusive development, despite the contrarian rhetoric. Thank you very much for your kind patience. I'm sorry if I had taken more time than you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kannan and Professor Hirway.